Late 19th century painting and sculpture. European painters and sculptors in the late 19th century pushed the boundaries of visual expression. Artists who were part of the Symbolist movement rejected the perceived materialism and moral bankruptcy brought about by an industrialized society. No longer content to work within the rigid confines of naturalism, realism, or impressionism, Symbolists based their works on fantasy and imagination. Here we have the famous Scream by Edvard Munch, Oil, Pastel, and Cassane on cardboard, 1893. And we have the Burghers of Calais by Auguste Rodin, a bronze from 1884 to 1889. Painting and sculpture, late 19th century, Europe's Belle Epoque. To celebrate the centennial of the French Revolution, Paris hosted a World's Fair in 1889. For many visitors and Parisians alike, the most breathtaking sight was the brand new Eiffel Tower, the tallest structure on Earth. The Industrial Revolution had made it possible, but beyond that it required a special vision even to imagine on paper this graceful spire, a monumental sculpture in iron, soaring almost 1,000 feet above the city. It was the perfect symbol for what the French president at the fair's dedication called this century of progress. Advances in science, technology, education, and human rights during the 19th century had made Europe powerful, prosperous, and peaceful. Later generations would wistfully recall the late 1800s and early 1900s as La Belle Epoque, the beautiful time. The Eiffel Tower of Paris, France, was a result of 19th century advances in science, technology, and industry. Undercurrents of gloom and strife. Yet beneath the surface of this supremely confident age lay signs of doubt. Many people wondered how long the era of growth, progress, and peace could possibly continue. Some questioned whether this tiny industrialized society with all its attendant material goods had actually made people happier or life any more meaningful. Philosophers and psychologists wrote about alienation and the irrational dark side of human nature. Many artists rejected the new mass culture and challenged long-held assumptions about the role of art in society and its relationship to the real world. Sometimes their efforts were rejected by critics and patrons alike as out of touch with community standards. In other cases, artists' works sent shockwaves through the very fabric of Western culture. And here we have Sigmund Freud theorizing that the unconscious mind, filled with powerful instincts, often determines human behavior. Edvard Munch. Norwegian artist Edvard Munch, 1863 to 1944, was a complicated man who expressed his emotional struggles through deeply personal paintings and prints. Munch learned drawing fundamentals while enrolled in a technical college. He then left school to pursue an art career, first in Oslo and later in Paris, where he was imbued with Impressionist and Post-Impressionist ideals. Inspired by the work of Paul Gauguin, Vincent van Gogh, Munch used line, shape, and color to depict distorted forms filled with passion and symbolism. In 1910, Munch returned to Norway and spent the final years of his life in an isolated rural estate. Unmarried and alone, surrounded by his artwork, he held deep attachments to his paintings and prints and often referred to them as his children. The Scream. Munch's most famous work and one of the most recognizable images of modern art is his painting The Scream. In it, he illustrates a personal memory of an earlier experience that he had on an outing with two friends. Plagued by feelings of abandonment and despair, Munch painted himself as a shrieking solitary figure standing on a bridge at sunset. True to the Symbolist movement, Munch used the figure and the landscape to communicate his personal feelings and ideas. Historians interpret the Scream in a variety of ways. Some believe that Munch's skeletal figure, placed beneath a blood-red sky, represents man's fear of death. Another interpretation suggests the painting embodies the subconscious fears one might experience in a nightmare. Others believe that the isolated figure represents the anxiety and alienation that plagued modern man in an industrialized society. What do you think The Scream is about? The Scream's meaning. Munch left behind a powerful statement in his diary explaining the events leading up to the creation of the Scream. He wrote, "I stopped and leaned against the balustrade, almost dead with fatigue. Above the blue fjord hung the clouds, red as blood and tongues of fire. My friends had left me, and alone, trembling with anguish, I became aware of the vast, infinite cry of nature." What is in a name? The title of a painting can help viewers understand the artist's intentions. The original title for the Scream was Despair, while some modern texts refer to it as The Cry. Which title do you think best suits the painting? In The Scream, Edvard Munch portrayed himself crying out in despair. Line, shape, and color. In A Clear Break from the Past, Munch did not subscribe to realist conventions regarding the human figure, nor did he embrace the Impressionist aim of capturing a fleeting moment in time. Instead, he used expressive lines and bold, sometimes garish colors to create stylized figures and landscapes that expressed his emotional reaction to his surroundings. An admirer of Gauguin's expressively abstract style, Munch infused his own work with feeling and imagination. How did Munch use complementary colors in The Scream? Munch uses touches of complementary hues to neutralize his intense color palette. Fiery oranges and reds swirl among the cool blues of the water, while light, icy blues emerge in the blistering sky. Auguste Rodin. Considered the father of modern sculpture, Auguste Rodin was a gifted artist who was fascinated by the human form. Born in Paris in 1840, Rodin spent his early years as a decorative artist. He longed to be accepted to the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts, but never gained admittance. Instead, Rodin toiled away as an apprentice to other artists and decorators for the first 20 years of his career. A trip to Italy in 1875 had an enormous impact on Rodin's style. Inspired by the works of Donatello and Michelangelo, Rodin developed an expressive style, sometimes referred to by art historians as early expressionism, of modeling figures in unconventional poses, strengthened by his rigorous study of human anatomy. His detractors accused Rodin of creating works that looked unfinished and did not adhere to the decorative, formulaic style fashionable at the time. Rodin persevered and did not change his approach to please critics. Ultimately, he achieved financial success and gained the respect of the art community. In 1912, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York opened a gallery dedicated to his work. Renaissance inspiration. Here we have these statues by Donatello, Michelangelo, and the famous thinker by Rodin. In what ways do you think Renaissance sculptors Donatello and Michelangelo inspired Rodin? And what ways do you think Rodin departed from Renaissance sculpting conventions? Burghers of Calais. In 1884, Rodin won a competition offered by the mayor of the French port of Calais to create a work commemorating a heroic act in this city's history. In 1347, during the 100 Years' War, King Edward III of England had laid siege to Calais on the north coast of France. After almost a year, the starving citizens asked for terms of surrender. King Edward agreed to spare the city if 6 prominent citizens or burghers would give themselves up for execution. 6 emaciated volunteers soon emerged through the town gate, wearing, as Edward had ordered, humble garments and nooses around their necks and carrying the keys to the city. In the end, their lives were spared by the intervention of Edward's pregnant wife, who feared that putting them to death would prove a bad omen for her unborn child. And here is the sculpture by Rodin. Individual figures within a unified composition. Rodin captured the emotional moment when the 6 men left the city, fully expecting to meet their deaths, not knowing that fate would intervene to save them. Rodin was keenly interested in creating a unified composition that conveyed the collective uncertainty, fear, and despair felt by the burghers. To capture their essence, he made multiple studies of each individual figure, first nude and then draped in burlap. Only then did he arrange them as a group. In a departure from traditional sculpture conventions, Rodin does not create an obvious front and back in Burghers de Calais, nor does he create a dominant focal point. There was a distinguished leader among the 6 burghers, but Rodin does not call attention to this figure. Can you guess which burgher is the leader? Eustache de Saint-Pierre, the figure second from right in this view, was considered the patriarch of the Burghers of Calais. For Burghers of Calais, Rodin relied on his imagination as well as historical accounts of the event to present each figure as a complex, conflicted individual expressing a mix of emotions. Instead of presenting proud, stoic heroes unified in their cause, Rodin portrays each man in an isolated moment of personal contemplation. Rodin depicts Eustache de Saint-Pierre, the leader of the group, in a vulnerable pose with his shoulders slumped forward. He was the first burgher to volunteer his life. Standing upright with his head held high in quiet defiance, Jean Dare grasps one of the keys to Calais. He was the second citizen to volunteer his life. Rodin depicts Pierre De Wausau with more emotion and less defiance. His head is turned to the side in despair, while his arm is raised to shield his face. What emotion do you think Rodin portrayed in the figure of Andrew d'André, with his face buried in his hands? Jean de Fienne stands with arms extended and mouth agape. Rodin exaggerated the proportions in each of the figures. He lengthened the arms and made each man's hands and feet much larger in proportion than the rest of his body, as Michelangelo did in his David. What expressive quality do you think that the enlarged hands add to the sculpture? Rodin's expressive figures. Unlike his Renaissance predecessors who chiseled and then polished rough marble to a smooth finish, Rodin first modeled his figures in clay and later had them cast in bronze. He used his fingers to render expressive variations in texture that captured the effects of light as it raked across the body. The visible fingerprints that Rodin left in the clay show how he worked, and also add movement and tension to the figure's muscles, which he hoped would ultimately capture the person's inner emotions. Rodin worked with several different foundries to create molds of his clay sculpture and then cast them in bronze. The molds could be used multiple times. This enabled Rodin to create many copies of the same sculpture. Currently, there are at least 11 known casts of Burghers of Calais. Do you think that a sculpture is more or less valuable if there is more than one original? Why? Response to Burghers of Calais. The civic leaders of Calais were appalled at Rodin's rendering of the important event that they sought to memorialize. They expected a monumental sculpture depicting bravely posed heroes set high on a pedestal. Instead, Rodin provided them with his own painfully realistic interpretation of the events. To make matters worse, Rodin mounted the figures close to the ground in a low base, so close that the viewer was nearly eye level with the burghers. Rodin wanted to convey the idea that everyday citizens are capable of committing heroic acts. Ultimately, response to Burghers of Calais was so negative that the commissioners installed it in a remote area and placed it high upon a pedestal, far from view. Sculptural innovations. Rodin's influence on modern sculpture was significant. His groundbreaking use of the low pedestal enabled 20th century artists to break free from the tradition of exhibiting sculpture on pedestals and paved the way for a creation of three-dimensional works that interact with the viewer's space. Quiz time. Which of the following elements did symbolist artists emphasize in their paintings? Fantasy and imagination. Which of the following is a characteristic of Edvard Munch's The Scream? The lines, shapes, and colors express Munch's emotional reaction to the surroundings. Which statement best describes Auguste Rodin's approach to sculpture? Rodin rendered figures in clay to capture expressive variations in surface texture.